All right, so in the previous video, we graphed the budget line and we looked at opportunity cost that we can get from the slope of the budget line. Now I want to look at what happens to both that budget line and the opportunity cost when we start to change income or relative prices. So in our previous videos, we looked at the fact that you had $300 set aside for entertainment that you were going to use to buy video games and phone apps. So we were looking at the limitations or the constraints that you have in the choice of how many phone apps and how many video games. Well, what happens to that constraint if your income goes from 300 to 600? Okay, so our budget line we constructed before was based on an income, and we'll set income with the symbol Y, and we'll see more of that in macroeconomics. So this was at 300. Well, now what happens if our income is 600? Well, if we spend all $600 on video games at $60 a piece, we can afford 10 of them. If we spend all $600 on phone apps at $2 a piece, we can afford 300 of them. And we could do like we did in the previous video, which is to look at what if we got one video game, how many apps could we afford? But budget lines are straight lines. And so we can connect our two extremes here to show that when your income increases, the budget line shifts out. And that should make sense, right? Because the more income we have, the more phone apps we can get, the more video games we can get, or we can get more of both. Okay? So we are less constrained in our choices than we were before. What if the income we have is 150? So if all we have is 150 to spend on video games and phone apps, and we spent all the money on video games, how many video games could you get? Well, it's 60 a piece. Okay. What is that number? Well, that number is what? 2.5. And if we spent all of our money on phone apps, we could get 75 phone apps. Now, you're telling me I can't buy 2.5 video games. Well, as we discussed in the previous video, we would still plot it at 2.5 because the budget line represents the combinations that we can afford. That uses all of the money. Where we actually end up in terms of how many video games and phone apps we are willing and able to buy is going to depend not just on what we can afford, but what we like. And there's no value to us to have a half of a video game. Can't really play it, doesn't really work. So we're going to end up in combinations that have whole number of video games. But we still want to represent graphically the combinations that use all of the money. Because if you don't, so let me just show you, for example, if we do this instead, then now these combinations on this line are not using all of our money. And so we can't find that optimal consumption point that maximizes the extra benefit, given the costs, including the opportunity cost, the trade-off, and our constraints. So we want to keep it to the theoretical on our graph because we'll probably end up somewhere at a whole number of video games. All right, so we've looked at a change in income and what that does to our budget line. It shifts it to the left or the right. Does it change the opportunity cost, the sacrifice? So notice that all of these lines are parallel to each other, right? They don't cross. The slope of these lines, are they different? No, because you'll notice that they're just shifting. They have the same slope. So if they have the same slope, then they have the same opportunity cost. The price of a video game relative to a phone app has not changed. So the sacrifice as we choose where on these budget lines is the optimal consumption point that maximizes the benefit given our costs and constraints. The trade-off between the two, between phone apps and video games, hasn't changed. So if we change income, it changes what our choices are. We can now get more or less, but it doesn't change that opportunity cost, the sacrifice between one and the other. Well, what happens if we start to change the relative price? So let's go back to having, so our income is 300. But what if we now change the price of one good versus the other? So let's say the price of video games is 60 bucks. Okay. And in the budget line that you see here, that's the one we drew before. That budget line is based on a price of apps. So let's write here. Price of app, $2. So the question becomes, what happens if we change the price of a phone app to $4? All right, let's work through it. If we have $300, the price of a video game is $60, the price of an app is $4. If you spend all $300 on video games, how many video games can you buy? Well, the price of video games hasn't changed, so all 300 bucks for $60 video games is still here at 5 video games. Now, if the price of a phone app is $4 and we spend all $300 on phone apps, then we need to take 300 and we divide that 300 by 4. And what do you get? You get 75. Okay, so we can draw our new budget line. So what has happened? Price of app equals 4. So what has happened to the budget line? Unlike with the income, it didn't just shift in and out. What happened is the slope has changed. So what that means is there's been a change in the opportunity cost. So before, when the price of an app was $2, the opportunity cost of a video game was 30 apps. And the opportunity cost of an app was 1/30 of a video game. Now, with the price of an app at $4, what's the opportunity cost of a video game? Well, how do we find the opportunity cost of a video game? Video game is here on the horizontal, so we simply find the slope. We start here at 75. So slope. We go down 75. We go over 5. We get a slope of negative 75 divided by 5, okay, which is a negative 15. So the opportunity cost of a video game is now what? 15 apps. So notice when the price of an app went up, to get a video game, the sacrifice to get a video game did what? Well, before the opportunity cost of a video game, so you buy a video game, you're giving up 30 apps. Now that the apps are more expensive, when you go to buy the video game, there's less of a sacrifice. You buy a video game, you're now just giving up 15 apps instead of 30. So the price of apps went up, the opportunity cost of a video game, so what you have to give up to get a video game, is now less. What about the opportunity cost of an app? Okay, how do we find the opportunity cost of an app? Well, app is here on the vertical axis, so we could go reverse. We could start at the video games and go over. Okay, we'd give up 5 to get 75, or we just flip the slope. We invert it is what we're doing. So instead of 15, it's 1/15. And remember, when you do opportunity costs, you always have to specify what are you giving up. The opportunity cost of an app is 1/15 of a video game. If fractions are not your deal, turn these into decimals. So take 1 divided by 30 in the calculator and get that number. Take 1 divided by 15 in the calculator and get that number. because you need to be able to see what's happening. When the price of the app went up, the opportunity cost of an app, did it go up or down? Well, every time we buy an app now, remember apps are more expensive, are you giving up more or less of a video game? Well, if you need more money to buy an app, you're now sacrificing more of a video game. So notice the opportunity cost of the app went from 1/30th. So think of a pie sliced into 30 pieces. That's what you were giving up before, that 1/30th, that one slice. Now that the apps are more expensive, think of your pie now divided into 15 slices, and you're giving up a 15th or one of those slices. So that piece of the pie is now bigger. If it's costing more to get an app, the sacrifice now to buy an app for your phone is going to be more video games. So intuitively, this should make sense. We're just going to turn this into numbers and graphs, breaking down the decision into pieces. Okay, so then when you're explaining people's decisions, right, you sound a lot smarter. You can use fancy terms like opportunity cost. You can show it graphically. All we're doing is showing basic decisions that people make, breaking it down, showing it in detail. Okay, so if we understand the pieces of decisions, then we can predict behavior and we can change behavior. All right, so what happens if the price of the phone app goes to $1? So we looked at $4. What if the price of an app is $1? So first, what happens to the budget line? Well, if we have $300 and we spend all $300 on video games are still $60, then the amount of video games that we can afford is still 5. If we spend all $300 on phone apps and they're now $1, we can afford 300 of them. So when we connect the dots to get our new budget line, notice the budget line is now a lot steeper. So when the price went up, it became flatter. Now that the price has gone down for the phone apps, it's a lot steeper. So what is this doing to the opportunity cost? Well, we're going to make the price of an app be $1. Let's find the opportunity cost of a video game. How do we do that? Well, we got to go and find the slope. So we start at 300, we go down 300. So our slope, let's find a spot to write this. Our slope here is down 300 and over 5. Negative 300 divided by 5. Excuse me, what do we get? We get a negative 60. So the opportunity cost of video games is what? Well, every time you go and get a video game, that's money you're not using on apps, and you are then giving up the ability to buy 60 apps. Okay. What's the opportunity cost of an app? Well, we can take that slope and just flip it, invert it. So 1 over 60 video games. All right, let's do a comparison. So when we look at the price, those higher prices of apps, when we dropped the price of an app to $1, now when you go to buy a video game, are you making more or less of a sacrifice when you get that video game? Well, if the alternative to a video game, these apps, are cheap, then every time you buy a video game now, you're giving up more apps than before. So there's a greater sacrifice to buy a video game now, even though the price of video games hasn't changed, even though your income, the constraint hasn't changed. Now every time you buy a video game, you're giving up more because you can't buy as many of the alternative. The opportunity cost of an app, when you go to buy an app, because apps are now cheap at $1, there's less of a sacrifice. It's now just 1/60th of a video game instead of 1/15th or 1/30th. So when we look at what's happening here, If our income changes, it does change the constraint. We shift a parallel shift to the budget line. That shows that we can now buy, if the income increases, greater quantities of both items. When we start to look at a price change of one of the items, one good or service that's on your graph, then that's going to change the trade-off, the sacrifice, the opportunity cost. So it'll change the slope of the budget line, which then starts to impact your choices in terms of, do I buy more of one item or less of one item based on the relative price of the good to the other, that sacrifice, that opportunity cost. In the coming videos, we're going to add to this because we can't just look at what things cost to make a decision. You are constrained by your income. You have to consider the cost of the item and the sacrifice that's made, but we also have to consider how much you like something, the value to you. So the next step in this process is to quantify the benefit.